Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has continually gotten inflation wrong. First, she said deflation was the concern. Then she said inflation was transitory. Wrong and wronger. Now she says she's considering cutting taxes at the pumps. Good. When Alberta did this, they reduced their inflation rate as higher energy prices drive inflation. Every G7 country is doing something on gas prices. When will she start fighting inflation and give Canadians a break at the pumps, or is she so content to be the wrongest person in the room at the next G7?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for the question. And let me just point out that when Canada meets our G7 partners, we are the envy of our peer countries. The IMF, the OECD, and Moody's have all pointed out that Canada is expected to have the strongest rate of growth this year and next year in the G7, and we have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7 and the fastest rate of fiscal consolidation. When it comes to affordability, our government is taking meaningful steps, starting with the OAS benefit going up this summer.
The Honourable Member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, these spend-EP Liberals love warning labels so much, there should have been a mandatory "this product causes inflation and will be harmful to your economy" sticker on the last budget. This Minister of Finance is fond of saying that her government can walk and chew gum at the same time. Well, okay then. Can she explain to this House how she can inject a post-COVID-19 stimulus of $100 billion into the economy and fight inflation at the same time?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the verdict of some objective experts when it comes to Canada's government policy. And I'm going to start with S&P, the ratings agency whose job it is to judge fiscal responsibility. After I tabled the budget in April, S&P confirmed Canada's AAA rating with a stable outlook going forward. And let me also point out that Canada today is tied with the U.S. for the fastest rate of fiscal consolidation. That means bringing down the deficit in the G7. That is fiscal responsibility, and it's appropriate.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, the current NDP Liberal budget spending is the most outside of a crisis in 3 decades. It's driving runaway costs of living and rising inflation. Food is up 9.7% since last year, the biggest jump since the 80s. Gas is a record high, over $2 a litre across Canada. It's almost $3 in big cities like Vancouver and Montreal. It's hard in rural areas too. Since last year, fertilizer's up 44%, feed's up 8%, and farm fuel's up 32%. Why don't the Liberals care that Canadians are really struggling right now just to get by?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government absolutely understands the challenges Canadians are facing today with the cost of living. But let me actually remind the member opposite of a statement that one of her colleagues made during the private member statements just a moment ago. One of her colleagues pointed out that higher food prices today are being driven by Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. We have to remember who is responsible for the challenges that Canadians are facing today.
For Lakeland.
The Liberals racked up more debt than every other government before it combined. Wow. That puts all Canadians on the hook, and they're worried whether they can make it. Scotiabank says the Liberals are, quote, doing nothing of any significance to slow inflation at the moment and missed their chance to nip it in the bud, the inflation they caused. RBC and BMO predict tomorrow's inflation to be 7.4%, over double from May last year. Liberal spending causes this skyrocketing inflation and forces Canadians to have to choose between heating and eating. Why do the NDP Liberals always make things so much worse for working, everyday Canadians?
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me take another opportunity to point out to Canadians listening to us that Canada is tied with the United States in the G7 for the fastest rate of fiscal consolidation, the fastest rate of bringing down our deficit. And Mr. Speaker, Canadians know inflation is a global phenomenon. It's driven by Putin's war in Ukraine. It is driven by China's COVID-0 policies. And I'll give you some numbers to back that up. Our latest inflation number is 6.8% in Canada. That's lower than the US, which is at 8.6%. Germany at 7.4%, the UK at 9%, and the OECD average of 9.2%.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, Daniel Leblanc, Radio-Canada tells us another good thing about this government. This morning, the Revenue Agency's investigation into the KPMG tax evasion scheme was completed 1 year ago. 1 year ago. They confirmed that they had been exonerated. The Minister of National Revenue said, "We'll catch them. This will be much simple when they are caught." Simple question. Why has she known that there was a conclusion for 1 year without telling anyone? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased and very surprised to hear that my colleague across the way seems suddenly very interested in fighting tax evasion. He no doubt knows that I can't make comments on specific cases. What is more, my colleagues should know that the agency is independent when it comes to its investigations and inquiries. I do not intervene in any of them, and I don't control what they do. We will continue to work vigorously in the fight against tax evasion here in Canada and abroad. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, it's the same minister who for weeks was saying, well, the trapdoor is closing. The reality is that she is the one closing the trapdoor on herself. Because in 2017, she said that she would publish the information publicly. But the investigation ended a year ago. The minister said that everything will be clearer when it's published. But for a year, she has said absolutely nothing. Why, once again, is the government refusing to be transparent? When it's time to talk, they don't talk. The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have already mentioned, I cannot make comments on specific cases. My colleagues should know that the agency is independent, which we do not intervene in their investigations, and we do not tell them what to do, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, just last week, the Minister for Finance made an announcement on inflation without a single penny for our farmers and producers. We have been warning her for months that agriculture is in danger. Inflation is hitting 3 times over. Fuel, fertilizer and feed prices are skyrocketing, adding yet another $1.5 billion to the bills of farmers and producers. If Ottawa does nothing, producers and farmers will go bankrupt and food prices will rise even higher. Farmers have been making concrete demands of the minister. When will she finally support them? The Honourable Minister for Agriculture. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I do agree with my colleague that our farmers and producers are working tooth and nail. And like everyone else, they are facing very high prices for feed, for inputs, and for energy. And that is the reason for which we have helped them in many ways. We've had the biggest budget in history at the Agriculture Department, $4 billion for the agricultural sector, and we are working on various different options to find out how we can even better help farmers and producers.